Coming up on a live special edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis of how it impacts your school community. Plus, it is May Revision Day. We've got all of the nuts and bolts of the governor's May budget revision. Plus, we'll give you the opportunity to ask questions.
The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
And it is just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Friday to the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with ACSA's Executive Director, Dr. Edgar Zazwata. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Again, welcome. We're honored to have you with us here on May Revision Friday. Go ahead and jump into our chat, say hello. Let us know where you're watching from, and go ahead and start putting your questions in there, folks, because we've got two experts who are going to come on and talk about the budget as well. Edgar, how are you? It is May Revision Day.
I don't get to be counted as an expert anymore.
No, not
I thought I'd try, but all right. Now I see how it is. I don't know if I would count myself as an expert even before with the old gig, but no, we do have two experts coming up. I'm very excited to get a chance to talk to Yvonne and Megan. I think you were going to ask me how am I doing, and I'm sorry, and I totally was rude and cut you off.
That's okay. You know what? Let's pass by how you're doing.
You don't really care how I'm doing.
You know what? I only cared other than the fact that you and I have basically spent the last few evenings together and full days. So I pretty much know, how you're doing. And let me ask you before we start talking about the nuts and bolts of the May revision. When the May revision comes out, what is this like for a legislative advocacy department, because you've been in the business for so long? Is it kind of a reset? Is it a restart of things, or is this just kind of part of the puzzle?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And this year, anomaly. So one of the reasons, at least my background's different. We've been, as Naj talked about, we had our governance meetings, our board of directors meeting just met here in Sacramento, not at the ACSA offices. So hence, sitting in a hotel room conference room here. So it made it a little tricky for us in terms of trying to navigate, our board meetings. We're talking about budget issues right as the budget is being released. So it's kind of instant reaction. But I think to the team and, to Megan and Yvonne and everybody else and, me in previous years, I think with May Revise, it's an interesting one. And I think this is one of the pieces that this year just things are, not that we've never seen this, because unfortunately we've been through years where the revenue picture changes. But I think we had some certain things we were looking for, right? Like the going into this, and I think we had this conversation last week with Patty. What are the areas that you're going to be looking for when this budget gets released? What's the LCFF number? What's what are they doing with the COLA? Did we see any other reductions, right? And so it was almost an instant reaction to go some of those pressure points that we thought the state may have to go after, because we knew coming into this budget that there were going to have to be some changes for May Revise because the revenue picture was not as positive. So that was our starting point, right? And I think as we're digging in, the caveat I'll say right now, because we always say it, and we really aim for this instant reaction, try to answer as many questions as we can. But I'm sure you're going to hear our team say multiple times, we're digging into it. We're going to have some briefings with the governor's office this afternoon. Oftentimes the devil's in the details in terms of things that get put out there. But we do really appreciate the opportunity to come in and give whatever information we do have at this point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say hello to Sheldon Smith, Jared Hungford, and Beth Ray, our first three on the comment section today. And if you are one of our new viewers and you're not used to seeing this show, we are live and interactive Wednesdays here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube, the regularly scheduled ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. So we hope you join us. Edgar, let me go through some of the particulars right now. The governor's January budget proposal had a $22.5 billion shortfall, and now we're facing a budget shortfall of $31.5 billion. Now, the May revision, according to the governor's office, does not reflect a recession, but recognizes the increased risks to the budget, especially new risks, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The May revision proposes to fully fund the 8.22% cost of living adjustment, maintains the equity multiplier, which will help accelerate learning gains and close opportunity gaps, continues to fully fund the first and second years of expanded eligibility for transitional kindergarten, fully funds universal school meals, which provides 2 meals to students each day of school. Of note, the demand for universal meals was actually higher than the governor budgeted for in January. So, Edgar, just hearing those particulars, those numbers, before we bring on our budget experts, your reflection on what you see.
Yeah, I think our initial reaction is okay. So first, the good news. I think the fact that the governor is protecting, where the lion's share of our revenue comes in. It's our ongoing revenue, our LCFF dollars. They're proposing to fully fund the cost of living adjustment. Even then, there was that was augmented even more so from January. I think that's a good thing, right? That was some of the pieces we wanted to protect that. The flip side of that does make us nervous, and I know Megan will probably get into this, that some of the ways that they're proposing to fund this is with one-time revenues. I know that's always a tricky proposition. If we're going to, us as a system are going to start making commitments ongoing, but the state may be in this precarious state that the only reason they're able to fully fund something like the increased COLA is because they're using one-time revenues toward that COLA. I know Megan talk more about that. So that makes us nervous, right? I think on the other pieces that obviously we knew this wasn't going to be, relatively speaking, we kind of set our expectations because of the revenue picture, but it still doesn't take away, even if we know the state had to make some difficult decisions, it doesn't take away the fact that there's going to be some hurt in the field. I mean, the use of retroactive cuts that have, authorizations that have been already out there. I know we spent a lot of time here since January talking about the instructional materials, arts, discretionary block grant. It has a long name. Essentially, it was something that the state said you could use it for these purposes, but essentially it's your discretion. We were pushing to restore that, and we actually thought we had a pretty good chance of getting that restored along the way. Unfortunately, because the revenue picture, as you noted, continues to decline, they've actually gone in the other direction, and they're proposing an even bigger cut there, right? Yeah. There's also some proposed cuts to some of the dollars that had been allocated before, having to do with learning recovery. So some tough news there, right? I think that what you said, and I think it's going to be reiterated by the state, this is a slowdown. I mean, there was projections of how much growth there was going to be in terms of the budget. We're not talking about a recession per se. This is really that the revenues haven't materialized. Yeah. So what is it the state going to do to try to balance that book, I think, is the tough part. I know there's going to be context about, we obviously focus on the education side of the budget. There's a lot of pain points on other aspects. If anything, they will probably say, well, K-12 doing pretty good compared to other parts of the budget. Again, that doesn't minimize the challenges that our folks will face that have to then now go figure out, okay, what do I do now in this situation? The state, these dollars that I had already allocated or that had already were spoken for because of negotiations or whatnot, what are we going to do on that piece?
Yeah, and I Rob Martinez, I see your question in there about the equity multiplier. We are going to, I mentioned the equity multiplier. We're going to try and get to as many questions today as possible. In fact, we don't have the normally scheduled 3 o'clock webinar, so we are going to stay on the air for anybody that has questions. So go ahead and drop those into the chat. A caveat to that, Edgar, is the fact that this May revision's only been out for a couple of hours. So, and there's a lot to go through. So we may have to pause on some questions and just take a little bit of time before.
Yeah, I'll plug right off the bat. You'll see our team while we're doing this and kind of doing this instant reaction, trying to answer some questions. I know the team's really working hard on getting our preliminary analysis that will go out to all of our members sometime today, so that will have a little bit more information, like we always do. Next week, I'm sure we're going to be talking budget. If we go into early next week, as we get some more of these clarifying details.
Yep. Well, let's bring in our guests right now. We're pulling them off of the written summary so they can come on here and give you a live and interactive summary. Ivan Carrillo is ACSA's Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations, and Megan Baer, ACSA Legislative Advocate. Ivan and Megan, so good to have you both on the show today. Ivan, let me start with you. What are the economic factors here as far as the May revision is concerned? And what did the governor and finance need to do to build this May revision, knowing that there's a very important number out there, and that would be the tax numbers that we don't have?
Yeah, hi Naj, hi everybody. You teed it up nicely in your introduction. I mean, there's this real significant shortfall that the state's having to respond to, and so you cited the number. It's grown $9 billion, the overall budget shortfall that the governor is including in his proposal from what we saw in January. So on the Proposition 98 side, it's about $2 billion in additional shortfall that's having to be addressed. We have an over-reliance in our budget design on personal income taxes. And so we've seen the wealthiest Californians not do well, in large part because of the stock market over these last number of months. So in January, we were hoping that we would see a turnaround in the economy. Unfortunately, that hasn't played out. So we've been bracing ourselves for what this May revise might include. And there's more uncertainty ahead. I think that was one thing that was clearly communicated by the governor. This has been communicated by economists, respected economists as well. We've talked about it a lot about the tax filing deadlines for most counties in California being kicked out until October. I mean, what we see playing out on the federal level in terms of the debt ceiling impasse as well is another factor that I think just gives some reason for concern, not only today and in this ultimate budget that's adopted in June, but just moving forward as well. So, yeah, I think one thing to underscore is what we heard from as well is that there are really difficult decisions that are going to have to be made here by the policymakers. Particularly on the 998 side. But don't want to be an alarmist by any means. And we're not back in the situation that we saw during the Great Recession. Notably, there is $10.7 billion in reserves for Prop 98 that are built up and included in the governor's budget. So we'll get into some of the details here momentarily about what we saw.
Yeah, Yvonne, you mentioned the non-Prop 98 side, so let's start with the Prop 98 side. Megan, what does the Prop 98 funding look like?
Thanks, Naj. So the Prop 98 guarantee actually drops about $2 billion. There's a $2 billion decrease. Per pupil spending is still going to be about $17,000, which is significant given if you look at like the last five years. Turning to LCFF, which is the local control funding formula, really, the biggest piece of Prop 98. The governor chooses to fund the full 8.22% statutory COLA. However, he is having to tap into one-time resources to make that possible. So that is concerning for the out years. If the economy doesn't turn around, we could, definitely need to tap into reserves, definitely find ourselves in some difficult times. And then I know Rob had asked about the equity multiplier. From what we can tell, the equity multiplier proposal that was released earlier this year has been maintained. So that $300 million that's going to be targeted to high poverty school sites, that is maintained. And so I believe, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly, the way that is going to be calculated is for school sites with a free lunch population, not free and reduced, a free lunch population of 90% for elementary and middle, and then 85% for high schools will be eligible to receive those funds, and they will have to go to the school site level, a little bit different than the way LCFF works.
Megan, you talked about LCFF, and we'll talk a little bit more about the COLA. I'm sure we'll get some questions there. The other piece, I know every time we did a show, every time you were on with us, or Yvonne, we got questions about this block grant. I know it was one of the focal points of our advocacy Ledge Action Day throughout the year. Despite the progress, just kind of reset it. I alluded to it at the beginning. What is the governor proposing as it relates to this discretionary block grant?
Yeah, this has been a big ACSA priority. The governor deepened the cut. So essentially, instead of sweeping a portion of the block grant, he's sweeping half of it. The remaining Districts got half their allocation, I think, in December, and we're scheduled to get the other half this spring. Under the governor's proposal, no district will see any more dollars coming out. So it's a 1.7 billion cut from last year, what was allocated. And I think what was really surprising was the governor also then proposed a second retroactive cut to the other block grant that was provided last year. So the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, it was adopted last year. It was $7.9 million. You had a pretty long timeline to spend it out to 27, 28. The governor's proposing to cut 2.5 billion of those dollars, which is a bit surprising because those dollars came with some strings. So we're kind of, right now we're doing some analysis to figure out exactly what this means, but districts are now going to be facing 2 retroactive cuts, which is concerning on several levels, but it's a really dangerous precedent to start cutting allocations that were adopted in a previous budget. And further, this budget does have new proposals, despite the revenue picture. There are new proposals here. So, overall, we're very concerned about the precedent that this sets.
And folks, if you do have any questions for our GR team about today's May revision, go ahead and put those into the comments and chat section. Megan, just before I move on to the next question, I just want to make sure I have clarity on this, because this has been a question that's been asked so often by our participants on our regular Wednesday show. That is no additional dollars for school districts in the arts and music block grant. That's correct?
No, there will be no additional dollars under the May revision. And just everybody remember too, this is the governor's proposal. We're going to then go into a very frenzied, month and a half where the governor has to negotiate with the legislature. And the legislature, especially the Senate, has been very sympathetic to our concern about retroactive cuts. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they respond. But this is just the governor's proposal at this point in time.
All right, let's ask. Let me ask about the current situation on transitional kindergarten. Obviously, this is one of the governor's, big deals, if you will, transitional kindergarten. What are you seeing in the May revision on TK?
So the governor stays the course in terms of his plan to roll out transitional kindergartens over the next several years. However, what's very notable is the enrollment projections for the current year are what has actually materialized in terms of student enrollment is significantly less than was planned for. So the funds that were needed to cover ADA for TK were almost 40% less than what the estimates provided. So the governor signals that he thinks it's going to tick up, but it's definitely interesting. And is it that parents don't know? Is it, part day programs? Why is the uptake rate so low?
Both this goes to Yvonne and Megan. I know Megan just alluded to talking about a little bit about the political landscape. The fact that even before we saw this May revise, at least on the Senate side, they had put out their priorities. And I know it's still early and we're keeping an eye on how are people responding. I'm sure there's very carefully worded messaging in terms of what they're going to say about this. But I'll start with Yvonne and get Megan's thoughts again. I mean, what do we see, given what we've seen in the budget hearings? What do we think the legislature's approach is going to be to this? Because they have an interesting balancing act, right? They want to make their constituents happy. They wanted to go and restore some of these. They're also somewhat limited by the revenue situation themselves, unless they find a way to bring in new revenues. I mean, what do we think the discussions are going to be like now as we have the May revise and the legislature has to react to it? I'll start with Yvonne.
Legislature, just like the governor, is very much steadfast in its commitment to continuing to fund the implementation of universal transitional kindergarten, universal meals, ELOP. And so those are areas that there's not going to be any reductions to funding those programs. So that for one. You saw a plan put forth by the Senate, and it was discussed here in an earlier segment of ours, which was proposing to increase revenues by, in part, increasing taxes, corporation taxes on the wealthiest Californians, and in doing that, looking to keep education whole. But that immediately got shut down by the governor, who put out a statement right after that proposal came out. He doubled down on that today. And so, I mean, honestly, they have to determine what numbers they're going to utilize for this budget. And then everything else, you work backward. I mean, you work backward from that number. And so it'll be interesting to see where these numbers shake out. I mean, typically you see the administration take a little more conservative approach. But there's a lot that's being thrown out there. The Legislative Analyst Office, which puts forth recommendations to the legislature, has talked about potentially not fully funding the statutory COLA as a way to potentially deal with this budget deficit as a differing approach from what you're seeing from the governor. But by and large, you saw a lot of alignment just in our conversations that we've had as staff, what our members heard directly when we're up here and as part of our legislative action days, what we've heard in committee hearings in terms of trying to keep education whole. But again, it ultimately is going to be dictated by what the numbers are.
Megan, I think we lost you for a second, so you may have not heard everything Yvonne said, but just to reset, anything you would add on just what we expect in terms of the political reaction now that from especially from the legislature? How do we think they'll maneuver this proposal?
Well, we hope they're going to push back on the retroactive cuts pretty hard. But you then do have some hard decisions. Like there has to be a reduction somewhere. So is it going to be to COLA, like the LAO recommends? And, for every 1% reduction to COLA, it's about $800 million in savings. So, you could still fund a pretty significant COLA. We'll just have to see how they respond, though. Hard to know.
And again, folks, if you have questions, go ahead and put those into the chat. We have a number of them that are coming in. Megan, we'll tackle some of those in just a moment. But when you and I spoke a few hours back, you found this interesting piece in the May revision about a proposed bill that has found its way into the May revision. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So, we think a Senator Portantino priority bill has found its way in based on what we're seeing. So Senator Portantino for several years now has pushed a proposal to require universal screening for dyslexia in schools specifically. In the governor's May revision, there is a proposal to require schools to screen for reading difficulties, including dyslexia. So a slightly different approach. The requirement would start in 25-26 school year, and it would be for kindergarten, first and second grade students. The governor does also commit to sending out resources to the field in future budget years, but we're very interested to see exactly what that language looks like. Is it exactly what's in the bill? Is it a little different? So we'll be keeping an eye out for that.
Megan, we got a question from Mina about ELOP. Will ELOP receive the same allocation next year, even though implementation and planning has been extended?
Yes, that's our understanding. The last 2 years, dollars went out, and they were slated to have to be expended by, I want to say, June 30th of this year. The governor is proposing to give districts one more year to spend down those dollars. He wants to make sure that districts have time to set up the best possible programs. The legislature and the governor have really signaled that they're all in on these programs, and they know they've heard loud and clear the last few years. It's been challenging for some districts to get this stuff up and running because of staffing shortages. So I think this is about providing support for a longer on-ramp, give districts a little bit more time to get these programs going. So we're pleased to see that.
Yvonne, you were just in Washington, D.C. for the ACSA CSBA Coast to Coast. So I'm going to send this one your way because it is about federal funds. Stan Rose asks, with the lifting of Title 42, is there any chance of federal funds coming to the state, with any coming to school districts for the services additional immigrant students may well need? While you were in D.C. having discussions, did Title 42 ever come up as far as, some decision points about sending federal funding to a state like California, where we do border another country?
It wasn't part of those conversations, but the topic has certainly come up since then. And so we actually have that question into our federal advocates there in DC. And so we'll circle back with the answer to that question with Stan once we get clarity.
Megan, we got a question. I know we were trying to answer this in the chat as well, but Lucy asked about percentage of the You mentioned the learning recovery block grant cut. Could you just reiterate what we're looking at in terms of reduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the too many block grants, it gets really confusing. So for learning recovery, 7.9 billion was adopted last year in the 2022 Budget Act. The governor is now proposing to retroactively cut 2.5 billion of those dollars. So I don't know the percentage off the top of my head because I can't do math that fast, but it's 2.5 billion.
Let me ask this question from Jonathan Brunson. He asked, since paying taxes for some areas of the state was extended to October 16th, will there be a revise once those dollars come in? Yvonne, let me have you start with that, and then Megan, do you anticipate anything, an October revision, if you will, once these monies start coming in?
Yeah, we were in a meeting with the Department of Finance recently, and they were very much downplaying that in terms of something very unexpected playing out between now and October that would require some real significant pivots. So in terms of them just following the trends to date, and then what their estimates are in terms of payments out versus payments in, again, felt like they had a really strong sense of what to expect. But certainly, I mean, that's a best estimate and a best guess as well. And so if it doesn't play out like they're assuming, then there may have to be some decisions that they circle back on, or budget be designed in a way that allows for certain triggers to take place potentially if things don't play out the way that they're estimated to be. So that's certainly a possibility that this could play out well into the fall.
Megan, I'll have you follow up with that, but because you've been inside the Capitol for a number of years before coming over to ACSA, something worth considering is a revise of the revise.
I mean, stranger things have happened, but I think, like Yvonne mentioned, there's different tools that the legislature will probably use. So trigger cuts, deferrals, they could also, instead of a trigger cut, they could do like a trigger fund if certain revenues materialize, and then you have it'll go out later. So I don't anticipate like a governor's revise, but I do think we will probably see different contingencies and tools like that being used in the budget in the case that revenue should materialize in the fall.
I have one more question. I'll ask both of you. I'll start with Megan. Just one big takeaways I know it's always dangerous to ask this question as we're still trying to digest it, dissect it. But just early on, what are just your big takeaways or anything that just surprised you? I know we knew some of this is coming in terms of the tough decisions, but if there was something that you weren't expecting that ended up in this proposal, I'll start with Megan.
I am really surprised to see them do a second retroactive cut. I said it before, but it's very concerning. I also think it's makes me very nervous that they're using so much one-time dollars to fund LCFF's COLA. About more than 3% of that COLA is funded through one-time dollars. So if there's not a complete economic rebound next year, we're going to have a hole in LCFF. So that makes me really nervous. Very interested to see how the legislature pushes back or what pieces they're okay with. But this approach makes me a little bit nervous that we're banking on the economy picking back up, and what if it doesn't? So,
Yvonne, your thoughts?
Yeah, for me, the big surprise was the second retroactive cut that we saw to the Learning Recovery Block Grant funding. Our folks have been beating the drum loudly, consistently. I mean, it certainly has resonated within the legislature about what this represents in terms of dollars that have already been budgeted for, and in some cases, dollars that have already been spent. And these dollars are directly serving students and accelerating learning and things that we know are just so critically important coming out of the pandemic. So, that was a big shocker for me, seeing that additional block grant being proposed to be reduced.
Megan, we have a question in here from Andrew Kirsten who asked, what are the chances of deferrals and how large for education?
We shouldn't see deferrals. The question is going to be, how big is the COLA? How big is the COLA is really what it's going to be. We're not looking at, even if the COLA was to come down a little bit, it wouldn't be in the process of a deferral. So that's, all this has to be kept in perspective, right? Like, we're not, like Yvonne said at the top, like, we're not back in the Great Recession. So we're just talking about what's the level of, funding that we're going to get, but we're not looking at cuts at this point in time, thankfully.
Okay.
Megan,
and go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think we both saw the question. I know Chris asked a question about court and community schools, about some additional funding there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a really big priority for our county office members and sister association was to secure additional funding for community and court schools, and they were able to do that. So there's $80 million in the budget for court and community schools that county offices run. There's also an increase to funding that goes with the differentiated assistance pieces. The governor's proposed to extend differentiated assistance from 1 to 2 years, and he provides a 50% increase to the base allocation to accomplish that. So, good news for our county office friends, some funding coming your way.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Yvonne Carrillo, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations, Megan Baer, ACSA Legislative Advocate. For both of you, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to having you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Want to remind all of our new viewers, because we've got about 100 or so of you today. We are live on Wednesdays with our live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break right here, ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Of course, we bring you the latest headlines and news from the state capitol and talk about proposed legislation. Of course, we'll probably be talking about the May revision again coming up. If you like what you see, go ahead and subscribe to us on YouTube or Facebook. When you subscribe, you'll get instant alerts when we're about to come on with a live show, and of course, a preview for our regular Wednesday show. And if you have great stories happening in your school communities, we want to amplify those in EdCal. Go ahead and send those to our EdCal editor, Michelle Carl, at mcarl@axa.org. Edgar, as we wrap, since we're past the bottom of the hour here, what is your one takeaway from this entire May revision, and then like the next steps? Because we already have this dollar figure. What was it? We're now facing a $31.5 billion shortfall as compared to 22.5, which was in the governor's budget proposal in January. So there's a lot ahead. But your thoughts on it as we wrap?
I mean, it kind of puts things in perspective. We've been talking about it for some months, that we were anticipating this would be a very different budget. That the years, I mean, just think about in the spring of 2020, we had that initial budget, which was obviously dire, but then they had the opportunity to revise that because of the revenue situation, coupled with the support that we were getting from the federal government, from the state government. So we've kind of been bracing ourselves for this real change in landscape. We've been talking about it over and over. Now it's becoming real. Now the bigger question is this a blip? Is this the start of a longer slowdown? Hence, and I think that's going to be the challenge on trying to mitigate some of the decisions that were made by the governor in terms of, okay, as Megan said this, if the legislature is going to go back and fill one of these holes, how are they going to do it? And does that end up putting us in a precarious situation down the line, right? And even with the pieces that they're funding, while on one end, good news, COLA funded, how they're funding, could set up for some interesting times ahead. So I think we're going to have to, just be prepared for that. I think us as ACSA, we were saying this to our membership this week. It's a reminder we're going to have to get louder in terms of our advocacy, protecting what we have. Take some solace. We have a wonderful team. You saw two of them there. Megan and Yvonne really have the pulse of what's going on, and undoubtedly we will be taking our members' input over the days to come. And hopefully, this is the start of a process. Even in May, it's a quick process, but the final product always looks different than what gets announced here in mid-May. So hopefully that's changes for the better here in the weeks to come.
That's right. Thank you, folks, so much for being with us today on this special edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Remember, we are live and interactive Wednesdays, 1 p.m. on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the day and weekend, and we'll see you next time.